Hello, and today we're talking about how to interpret and how to use tests. This obviously is another one of the key concepts and considerations that we need to think about in terms of assessment and testing. So today you will find out about the useful information you can get from tests and assessment. But first, I want to start with a definition. Here is a fish. Why a fish? Well, I want you to imagine that someone says to you, to prove you can feed yourself, go out and catch a fish. So I can do that, you can do that, your next door neighbour can do that, the person over there can do that. We can all go out and catch a fish. So this is an example of a criterion-referenced test. You set a standard to meet, you meet the standard, you pass the test. We're all the same. We can all catch a fish. This is one of the terms that we will be using today when we talk about interpreting and using tests. And to help us to understand that, I'm joined by Dr. Peter Gu from Victoria University of Wellington.
So today, Peter, we're talking about a question that is of huge importance to teachers, and that's how to interpret and to use the information you get from tests. You know, after all, we give students tests, we carry out all forms of assessment. What do we do with it? How can we use it for our benefit and for our learners' benefit? So I thought we might start by talking about two terms that are often used in this area, norm-referenced and criterion-referenced. So let's start with norm-referenced. Can you tell us what norm-referenced is and what its primary purpose is?
Yeah, it's actually a matter of test purposes and test interpretation as well. So norm-referenced tests normally are the tests that you use for ranking purposes, for policy making purposes, because the interpretation of the test scores rests on how well each individual student performs as compared to everybody else on the who took the same test. So that's why it's called norm-referenced. The interpretation of the score of the individual student is interpreted according to how well that score compares to the rest of the group, the norm. Whereas the other type, the criterion-referenced kind of assessment, focuses on how well each student or your class of students perform against the criteria you have in mind. The curriculum or whatever you're teaching them that week. So it doesn't really compare with anybody else. So that's why it's criteria referenced in terms of interpretation. The purposes for criterion referenced tests or assessment, it's basically for to see how well students have learned individually or as a class, and how well you have taught them.
So in a criterion-referenced assessment, everybody can do equally well?
Sure. Ideally, as a teacher, you would expect your students to perform not just equally well, but all perfectly.
So 100% pass,
Exactly.
100% getting it 100%.
You don't care about anything else. You care about how well your students learn. So ideally, 100% pass will be definitely perfect.
Okay. So whereas a norm-referenced, it's also about ranking students, so from the best to the not so good.
Sure. For that kind of purposes, you want to distinguish your students, the top from the bottom. Otherwise, you won't know who to give the money to.
Right.
As for example, administrators, you don't know which school performs well, which school needs help, which particular class or particular student are really performing above the rest, and so on. So those are normally for administrative purposes.
Okay. And so I suppose we can't be too black and white about this, but I'm guessing that criterion reference would work well with small groups like your own class, and norm reference for large groups.
Normally, yes, but as you said, it's not that clear-cut. If you have, for example, the whole district, for example, learning to the same curriculum, and you are in charge of designing a test, for example, for this particular semester, your purpose is to see how well your students have learned through this semester against the criteria set in the curriculum. Yes, you are still doing a criterion-referenced assessment, no matter how large the group is. You don't care about how each individual student performs against other students.
Okay. And so if you're a classroom teacher, how do you decide which type of assessment is better for your class?
Again, it's the reason you're designing a test is you are given that job for a particular purpose. It's all determined by your purpose of designing the test. Whereas for the classroom teacher, even if you're not designing the test, we're talking about interpreting test results. A lot of times teachers don't design their own tests. They're given a test to be used among their students, and you know, for interpretation of test scores, the teacher also has to be considering the purpose of the test. Mm-hmm. For the criterion reference kind of test, your interpretation is how well your students have learned, rather than how they compare to each other. Whereas for the criteria, for the norm reference kind of tests, your purpose is also for the improvement of your students. Of course, the major purpose, the administrative purposes, is beyond the teacher's control. It's basically for the principals, for the for policymakers, for accountability purposes normally. But for the teacher, the interpretation will have to focus on the understanding that for any test, it's not static. It's an indication of your students' ability to perform on those tasks, those test tasks included in the test at that moment. It doesn't mean the student has a low score, the student will not be able to improve. So the interpretation of the norm reference test even for a teacher in this case will be, okay, the student now didn't perform well on this test. Roughly, although it doesn't give you detailed information, but roughly the student didn't perform well on this particular part of the test, so I will improve the student's learning after getting this information. Another kind of way of interpretation will be a test is a representative sample of performance, basically. So it's no matter how good a test is, it's only a small sample. So it doesn't mean if a student doesn't perform well on this test, the student is a poor learner, or it basically dropped the evaluative values from your interpretation of the test.
Okay. So there's a great deal in what you've been saying. So let me just pick out what I think are some of the key points and check I'm understanding. So I guess one point is that if you work in a situation where you are required by your employer, by your principal, by the administrators to rank the students, you'll need to have some norm reference testing. Yeah?
Sure.
Okay, and another key message I think was in what you're saying is that we should never rely on just one test to make an evaluation of a student's learning. And this comes down to, I would guess, reliability issues, that we need multiple points of assessment to give a reliable indication of a student's ability.
Definitely. It's the evaluative part that's crucially important for the norm-referenced big summative tests. Sometimes in very high-stakes situations, after a high-stakes test, we hear about tragedies of students, committing suicide, for example. And part of it is wrong interpretation on the student's part. So the interpretation on the teacher's part should also be interpreting the score as just a small sample of the student's performance, which is only a small sample at that point, and the student can improve and convey that information to the student as well.
I think that's an important message, and it comes to a question about how teachers use this data. So do you think they should display it publicly or share it publicly in class?
Oh, sure. That's a traditional bad practice.
Bad practice. Yeah.
So for a lot of high-stakes testing situations. And normally it's used as a motivation measure, but basically the shaming and naming of students, especially the poor performers, will never actually be a good motivation factor.
Yes, I often think that we should be invested in the success of our students, and that the tests should be, an assessment should be a form of celebrating success and celebrating learning. And so it always seems to me rather perverse to draw attention to failure in these situations.
Sure. Even actually showing the students, for example, only the top 10 students in your group will probably do a bit of trick in terms of motivating those top students and a few bottom students to catch up. But that has never been proven to be a major factor in improving student learning.
So I guess maybe the key message in all this is that teachers should treat their learners with respect when they're giving out results, and not shaming and humiliating students in their use. And the other key message, of course, is the importance of not over-interpreting, perhaps, of not relying on just one result to judge a student's performance.
Yes, of course. So a test, no matter how good it is, no matter how representative the test tasks are, no matter how fully the test desired content is covered, it's a representative sample within that hour. So it's never an indicator of a student's full ability in that particular domain of learning. So the interpretation of the test should always remain there and not being overly interpreted, especially in terms of the student's worth.
So I think that comment, Peter, is a very good point to end on. We need to respect our students and not overinterpret from the results. It doesn't make them good or bad people if they don't get a high score. Thank you.